The road home has brought you many conversations about nationalism so far, and one of the things you might have noticed is a lot of nationalist ideas are associated with right wing political parties. But many left wing political parties also have ideas that could be called nationalist. We just don't call them that, such as single payer healthcare. In the United States, left wing politicians rarely use nationalism when they're talking about their vision for the country. So we reached out to freelance journalist Zaid Jilani to talk about this trend on the left and explore themes of nationalism in American politics. Zaid is a writing fellow at the University of California, Berkeley, and former reporter at The Intercept. This conversation with Zaid was recorded in spring 2020. So the first place I want to start is with the kind of gets floated around. It's a bit of a buzzword now, I suppose, but the idea that American politics is realigning, and that there is some growing faction of populists on the left and right that perhaps not operating together, but have a similar objective in wanting to challenge the establishment in their respective parties. And I suppose also disrupt some of the economic consensus on both ends of the political spectrum. I was wondering if you could comment on that and whether, one, you agree with that, if that is what is happening in American politics right now, and whether you think or whether you think that's something that should happen in the first place. Is that even a worthwhile objective for people on both sides?
Yeah, so there's probably two kind of definitions of populism people are using when they talk about this. So for one, I think it's maybe what Chris Hayes, who's an MSNBC host, writer for The Nation, or he was for a while, he talks about like insurrectionalists and institutionalists. So there's people who kind of trust existing institutions, both national and multilateral, international. And then there are those who like deeply distrust them. And I think that definition of populist is used a lot to describe politics in the United States, also in other places. But there's also, I think, and maybe this gets more to what you were asking about, there's a populist movement in terms of people who are seeing kind of structural issues in the economy and want to kind of reshape the economy in particular in terms of populism. Everything from trade policy, somewhat on immigration, particularly on the right, to banking policy, to monopoly and competitive markets, issues like that. And I think that kind of populism is a little bit different because the first is almost more stylistic. I think the insurrectionalists and the institutionalists often have very stylistic differences in terms of how they practice politics, in terms of campaigning, the way they present their ideology, the way they present themselves publicly. But I think the second group of people is more of what we're seeing now in terms of, let's say, a faction of Democrats and Republicans who care much more about monopolies than they used to, and care about concentration in the agriculture sector or concentration in financing and banking and mergers and acquisitions, and generally think that kind of the old norms of how Americans kind of conceive of their economy have been kind of decimated by the new order of kind of bigness and concentration. And I think that type of populism is probably much smaller. I think in terms of elected officials, the group of populists on the right would probably be limited to, three or four U.S. senators who are Republicans, who I think are thinking in that direction now. That would include people like Josh Hawley from Missouri. He's probably the prime example in that he's a Republican who wrote a decent-sized kind of almost biography about Theodore Roosevelt. He sees himself as more in that tradition, which is kind of an older Republican tradition that is pre-Reagan era. I think in the 60s and 70s, you'd have seen a lot more Republicans like him. He's probably the prime example in terms of he has, I think, the most interest in doing that. But we also have other Republican senators who I think are not quite as ideological as him, but are interested in some parts of it. So, for instance, Senator Marco Rubio from Florida, historically has been a fairly orthodox Republican, but in recent years has gotten much more interested in industrial policy, much more interested in talking about offshoring manufacturing, tax rates, like corporate tax rates and child tax credit was a big issue for him, where he wanted a slightly higher corporate tax rate than the one the Republicans settled on in order to fund a child tax credit. So I think he has some interest in that. There's also a little bit of interest from Senator Mitt Romney from Utah, as a newly elected senator. I think he cares about certain parts of tax policy and industrial policy and worker and wage policy. His former policy director during his presidential run, Orrin Cass, has actually started a project called American Compass. And American Compass is sort of a think tank based on reorienting conservative economic thinking towards in a more populist direction. And then I think, Tom Cotton out in Arkansas is somewhat supportive of some of these efforts, although he's much more orthodox in his thinking overall. He's more of, I think, a nationalist on issues like immigration or on China, for instance, than he is thinking about issues like monopoly power. He doesn't say a whole lot about Walmart, which is based in his state, which is obviously very powerful monopoly power. So I don't, I think that that's a small but growing faction. And I think there's also support outside of legislative bodies for that. So for instance, I think there's some intellectual forces on the political right. For instance, the Tucker Carlson show on Fox News promotes a lot of these same themes, saying that the right has to rethink their kind of focus on economic libertarianism, laissez-faire, this idea that most of the benefits in society can be delivered by corporate organizations and business structures. And I think that this is a growing body on the right, and there's interesting overlaps with the left. So for instance, Josh Hawley has joined legislation with Tammy Baldwin, who's a progressive Democrat from Wisconsin, kind of a more liberal-leaning state in the United States. He's worked with other senators on issues like dealing with tech companies. He's been on legislation with Democrats. He worked with Sherrod Brown, who's kind of a labor populist type Democrat in Ohio, on issues like debt collectors. And I think that there is a little bit of a left-right alliance that's growing there in terms of a lot of people feel concerned about these things. And if you poll the American people about these issues, there tends to be a lot of overlap between people who call themselves Republicans and those who call themselves Democrats. Like something like half of Republican voters say they support a wealth tax similar to what Elizabeth Warren proposed during her presidential race. Maybe somewhere between 40 and 50% of Republicans support some substantial increase in minimum wage. A lot of Republicans are concerned about trade policy. A lot of Republicans, I think, are concerned about the presence of so much money in politics. So I think at the grassroots level, there's a lot of overlap. The question is, how does it actually break out into the legislative level, into the actual official political parties, especially when the political parties rely so much on financing from a fairly small group of donors, many of whom do not support populist type politics. So for instance, when Marco Rubio ran for president, he was heavily reliant on donors who I don't think had any love for some of the things he's doing now. When you run for president, you have to raise, potentially hundreds of millions of dollars. It's very difficult in that environment. And even running for Congress, I think members of Congress regularly spend, 20 or 30 hours a week fundraising or something like that. They have to because the campaigns are so expensive. So it's a little bit more difficult to see how this actually shapes formal politics in the United States. Right now, it's in a very nascent stage. But I think it is starting in terms of what you described, in terms of how we're seeing some kind of overlap between populists on both sides on some issues, even though on other issues, like I think immigration, there isn't as much overlap there.
Yeah, and do you think that there's so to your point about immigration, I mean, some of the right-wing politicians you mentioned and their supporters would be quite easily called nationalist in their beliefs, and people wouldn't bat an eye. It seems fitting, I think, to many narratives. Whereas if we were going to talk about, Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren and their supporters, no one would really use the word nationalist to describe that kind of populism. And yet, when it comes to policy, I wonder if that's actually is that a meaningful distinction to begin with? So, for instance, like if we were talking about universal healthcare, seems like a policy that you could call nationalistic in that it's putting the respective needs of disadvantaged people within your country. It's elevating them to the point of it being a priority. So should that be called nationalism? Like, is there a way to sort of square the difference in why we use nationalism for some of these populists but not for others?
Yeah, so I think particularly in the European context, which is obviously in the West, we're spending a lot of time talking about countries that use similar languages to us or similar forms of government are in our cultural sphere. I think within the European context, the word populist is often interchangeably used with nationalist. They tend to refer to somewhat right-wing parties that are not establishment as populist. They very rarely refer to left-wing parties in Europe as populist, although maybe sometimes occasionally you'll see that. So I think that's part of why that kind of distinction was created. Traditionally speaking, populism has had some nationalistic characteristics in that people are talking, the people who are doing populist kind of work. So in the early 20th century, that would be like Theodore Roosevelt in the United States. They tend to be promoting some form of civic pride or national pride, talking about improving their country. Theodore Roosevelt was also quite nationalistic and antagonistic towards other countries at times. He was a supporter of some forms of imperialism, for instance. And I think that there has been some overlap, but it's kind of difficult to say that the two things are analogous or they're always aligned, in the sense that I think populism, we think about that as rallying the people, kind of promoting democratic widespread power versus small elite groups. And I think theoretically that could be done on an international level or in an internationalist form. But due to the constraints of sort of our systems of government, we typically do that in a more nationalistic framework. So for instance, you just mentioned like universal healthcare. Yeah, like obviously like universal healthcare, as it's promoted in the United States, is to benefit Americans. We could underwrite the entire healthcare budget of Haiti for much cheaper than giving universal healthcare to Americans, but we're not talking about doing that, right? So in a sense, it is nationalistic, although even there's a range. So for instance, I think Bernie Sanders said that even if somebody is in the country without papers, without documentation, maybe they entered illegally or they overstayed their visa, they would still get universal health care. Now, of course, they're still residents of the United States. They still live in our borders. So it is still somewhat nationalistic, although maybe it's a little bit more of a range than some Americans would object to somebody who came into the United States illegally getting health care. Which is interesting because it kind of brings up the question of what is nationalism and what is like the nation state itself. If somebody's within the territory of the United States, if they are working, maybe they even contribute to taxes in some way, are they part of the nation, even if they don't have citizen status, even if they don't have legal resident status? I mean, I think that's a very interesting question. And maybe that also gets into the question of like, what constitutes nationalism? Because some people, I think, immediately associate nationalism with ethnic nationalism or ethno-nationalism. And I think to some extent that's fair because historically, a lot of nationalism has been in that variation. So like nation states are often formed around ethnic identity or tribal identity. Many parts of Europe, for instance, were that way. However, in the United States, it's a little bit different. And the United States was not really founded on blood and soil. It was founded more on civic identity, even though that civic identity was not equally applied, for many years. It took many years of court cases, and there was a civil war, and so on and so forth, to really bring that to life. But at least the ideals were that this isn't a country for a certain bloodline, for instance. So for instance, like in Germany for a long time, it was very hard to get citizenship if you didn't have a German bloodline. I think they changed some of the laws recently, made it a little bit easier. But the United States never had anything like that. We have jus soli, which is like if you're born on U.S. soil, you're automatically a U.S. citizen, which is something that most of Europe doesn't have. But I think most of the Americas, like South America and North America, has that in place. So, yeah, I mean, I think that the distinction you're raising is really interesting because there is overlap between nationalists and populists. But they're also distinct categories, and they can actually kind of go against each other in certain contexts as well.
Do you think that people let's, for the sake of simplicity, let's call it left-wing populism, but we're thinking about Bernie and Warren and the DSA and some of these folks. Do you think they are naive about how nationalistic some of their politics actually is. Like, for example, the amount of faith that some of these political perspectives have in the federal government to be a conveyor of the self-interest of millions and to be a powerhouse in building more equal society. It feels like a kind of nationalism that isn't really being acknowledged as that's what it is. And I suppose in the global context, it's also signifying, I think, to other people that, myself, for example, as a Canadian, that I should also be thinking about my nation state as like the defender of my self-interest. And so if everyone took that position of, our governments should be very powerful, very influential, and should advance the needs of the working class, it feels like that's inevitably leads to some sort of nationalistic kind of competition. And I don't think that's always acknowledged as a consequence of some of the left-wing populist politics. Do you agree with that? Am I missing something in that analysis?
It's changed a little bit, at least rhetorically, within the past, I don't know, 6, 7 years. Because traditionally, yeah, I think that if you are more on the political left and you are somebody who thinks about using the national government as a tool on behalf of workers, you're typically going to have a more nationalistic form of politics. So even like, Cesar Chavez in California, who was a Latino labor organizer, he hated like illegal immigration because he saw that as undercutting like his labor, his wages in California. He was quite an agitator against that. And traditionally, a lot of the labor movement in the United States was that way. But I think in the past 6 or 7 years, many of them have adopted, at least rhetorically, softer language about the rest of the world. And part of that is I think they've equated anti-racism or civil rights with internationalism. So, they probably at some level still think that foreign competition undercuts American workers, but they won't necessarily describe it that way because they view it as prejudicial or bigoted to make that argument. And I think, so yeah, I think it is kind of a tension within what they're saying. Like, so for instance, a difference between like a left kind of populist like Elizabeth Warren and a more conservative type populist like Josh Hawley is Hawley right now is trying to get the administration to prohibit certain forms of worker visas. With very high unemployment in the United States, he thinks that, this would undercut people as they're trying to get work. I don't think Warren is trying to do anything like that, although maybe intellectually, if she follows her philosophy, to its logical end, she would see that, maybe there is some shared interest with some of her goals. But I think just in the way that the two tribes have sorted themselves, the right is much more comfortable with openly acknowledging the role of immigration with the economy. Whereas I think the left, they used to acknowledge it quite a bit, but now I think they see it as maybe helping further discrimination or bigotry if they do that, because they also associate that with people who dislike immigration for cultural reasons or racial reasons or, out of reasons of discrimination and prejudice. And I think those two things, the economic side and the cultural side, have so been enmeshed in some of the way they think that I think a lot of them are just less likely to admit those things. Now, I think if Elizabeth Warren was president, she probably would take these things into consideration. Like, she would actually take into consideration the impact of immigration on American wages, particularly on the lower end. And she would probably administer policy that way. But I think just rhetorically, because of where kind of the political tribes are right now, they're just less likely on the left to acknowledge that they are, that a lot of their goals do rely on some form of nationalism, even if they're somewhat uncomfortable to admit it for the reasons I described.
Yeah, and I think in your breakdown there of the differences between the left and right, it seems like some form of identity politics is relevant on both sides. Like if right-wing populists who want to address economic issues are also sort of in that group is mixed with, people who have some of those prejudicial impulses around immigration, for example. And then on the left, you have people who don't want to perhaps acknowledge some of the nationalism required to achieve their policy objectives because of their concerns over racial politics and things like that. It seems almost like the identity politics is what keeps the populists, let's say, on both sides, perhaps from being able to work together in a way that might be optimal to achieve the legislative changes you described? Do you think that's, a barrier?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about because I think maybe more so the outside activists or intellectuals feel that way. Because when you're in that position, you don't really have to work with anyone else. You can kind of play to an audience or a choir. Although, of course, these outside people are influential on lawmakers and legislators and pushing them in different directions. But typically, though, within a legislature, you'll see people work together across very broad coalitions as a course, as par for the course in terms of how they are getting legislation through. So that's not super unusual. It may be that, though, because it influences so much of the wider kind of cultural debates, this kind of sorting that we were talking about, that it does actually end up influencing the legislative process. Because, for instance, I don't think that, for instance, people who are working in the intellectual space on the left just talk to people on the right very much. And partly that's for exactly the reason we were describing. I think they see the world and they see their kind of national obligations as very different right now. And I think that probably decreases the chance of cooperation between the two sides overall, even if within a legislature itself, people are expected to cooperate even when they disagree. If they disagree on 9 out of 10 things, the 1 out of 10 things they agree on, they may work together on bills about it. And we've seen that in the past on issues like, for instance, surveillance. Like, there are typically Republicans who care a lot about surveillance now, who try to limit government surveillance, and there are Democrats who care a lot about it and try to limit government surveillance. So they work together on legislation. We see that quite a bit. But I also think that took a while to build that coalition. And those people on the outside who are in the different camps had to learn to work with each other as well in order to form the bonds that push legislation through. So I think on the outside level, it hasn't really come together in any way yet. On the inside level, you are seeing people like Josh Hawley work with Democrats. I think you are going to see people like Mitt Romney start working with Democrats more, and they have a desire to do that. But that effort would be eased by changing the politics on the outside, because I think, someone like Hawley also feels very uncomfortable working with someone like Bernie Sanders, because Bernie Sanders has that left-wing reputation. Hawley has a large Republican voter base. He relies on the support of conservative media in order to create his profile. So I think that the lawmakers are probably more eager to work together than the people on the outside, just because of the nature of their institutions. But the people on the outside do matter. They do help change the terrain under which lawmakers can walk, because, a lot of these lawmakers have higher aspirations. For instance, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren ran for president, right? And if Democratic voters are very hostile to Republicans or to perceived Republican populists, then it would be harder for Warren or Sanders to run for president if they were seen as too close to those people. So, for instance, like Elizabeth Warren during her presidential run refused to go on Fox News. Interestingly, she had gone on Fox News prior to that. Like, before she decided to run for president, she would go on sometimes. But she wouldn't do it during her presidential one. And I think maybe they perceived it as, helping cater to a Democratic-based decision like Fox News. Bernie Sanders made a different decision. He decided he would go on Fox News and do a town hall. Pete Buttigieg also went on Fox News and did a town hall. So I think, they make these calculations differently, but because they're trying to appeal to larger audiences and they have these other goals besides just getting legislation through, that does sometimes alter their kind of calculus.
So if you're one of those outsiders, let's say you're part of some think tank or a PAC or something, and you say, I want to help make sure Josh Hawley or Marco Rubio is running for the presidency in 5 years, instead of, let's say reverting back to some more libertarian style Republican candidates. Is it worth thinking basically that the language of nationalism, the symbolism of nationalism, is so tainted for people on the left that it's not necessarily a way you're going to win over some of those populist voters who lean left, let's say in their basic orientation? Or is there a way, you think, to rebrand some of that so that more Bernie voters and more Warren voters might be open-minded to that kind of populism that may be in a different package, but on economics might wind up looking very similar?
Yeah, I mean, I think among the wider American voter base, a lot of them are much more open to nationalistic messaging. And I think we saw that with Joe Biden. Joe Biden has been cutting ads attacking Trump on China. I think some people on the online activist left wing space were very uncomfortable with that, but I doubt there was a whole lot of discomfort among the voter base because the voter base in the United States overall is still fairly nationalistic in terms of how it orients itself. I think a lot of the outsiders are in more kind of elite cultural spaces where they feel a certain way about these issues and they wield a lot of influence in politics, but they're not necessarily the same as the voters. So I think, yeah, I do think there would be a lot of room if they decide to make those decisions. For some time, Elizabeth Warren, during her presidential campaign, was speaking about economic patriotism. And I think a lot of her rhetoric, for instance, talking about people or companies or high net worth individuals stacking money overseas, moving jobs out, those kind of things. I mean, that is nationalistic rhetoric. You're saying that, you know, that money and that capital should be in the United States rather than in another country. I mean, it may benefit another country. It may benefit Switzerland for countries to have, you know, tax shelters there, but it doesn't benefit the United States. So I think they were kind of using it. I think that, part of the issue is just that a lot of the people at the elite level on both sides, both the Republican side and the Democratic side, are probably more polarized than the voter base as a whole, and they're more like ideologically sorted. So I think a lot of people who would work for a potential like another Marco Rubio presidential campaign or Josh Hawley presidential campaign are probably lifelong Republican staffers who are used to talking about things a certain way, so they'd be uncomfortable using more openly like social democratic type rhetoric. Or a lot of people who work for Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren are increasingly going to be people who are uncomfortable with nationalistic type rhetoric, even of the sort that maybe Barack Obama or Bill Clinton used, because they used quite a bit as well, if you really go back and look at their speeches. So I think that's part of the problem, is that sometimes the environments at the campaign level in politics are just not, you know, they're not ideologically diverse enough. They tend to be much more, they tend to be much more kind of siloed, I guess, than some of the wider voter base. Because among the wider voter base, there's actually a lot more overlap between voters. Like a lot more people on the right and the Republican voters are open to some form of left kind of leaning populist rhetoric about working class, the rich, corporations than we imagine. And a lot of people who are Democratic voters, I think, are much more open to rhetoric about patriotism, about nationalism, about civic identity than maybe you'd think if you were reading like The Nation or The New Republic. It's just a matter, I think, of elites being more responsive to that. And sometimes elites kind of get in a bubble, I think, in sort of these political environments.
Yeah, and I know. I mean, I as a follower of your Twitter account, I feel like your commentary is really good at cutting through that bubble on a number of issues. I assume that's a conscious decision you make as far as like wanting to show people that some of these connections and some of these concepts look differently outside of the Twitter conversation. And I guess in closing, I'm wondering if you could give us your thoughts on whether you think that these social media platforms are they going to consistently, do you expect them to consistently be out of step with some of the open-mindedness that the average voter has? Or do you think that we will eventually get to a point where it feels like the online conversation is actually reflecting what the on-the-ground conversation looks like?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say because there's probably two different problems that prevent it from, there are two different factors that would prevent it from being more representative. One is that not that many people use something like Twitter, like very few Americans actually use Twitter. And even among the ones who have accounts, I think most people like don't even check it every day. You know, they might check it a few times a month or something. And they don't participate in conversation very much. A lot of them just watch. So that's one problem. And that problem could potentially be ameliorated if there were more people using it, which over time there will be. But the second problem also is that the social media companies themselves kind of create incentives for tribalism, for speaking to your own group, for sorting yourself. And you just don't, the gamification of it, the way that you get the hearts, the likes, the retweets and everything, they typically aren't based on kind of having nuance or having a more heterodox kind of worldview among like homogenous tribes. So that part is a little bit more difficult to deal with. And I don't know. I feel like social media companies themselves have recognized this as somewhat of a problem, even though honestly some of their profit is probably made from continuing to further this. But we may see some changes in technology that make it easier for people to kind of step outside of bubbles and to actually have the cross dialogue. Because the reality is that if you have the reality is if you just look at what people actually think when we survey people, it tends to be people tend to be way more open-minded than you think, and they tend to overestimate how closed-minded other people are. Yeah, they tend to think the world is much more tribal than it actually is. But that perception can become reality if everyone's thinking that, right? And if they don't really, if they really feel like I have to have certain points of view and I can't step out of that because everyone will be angry and they won't accept it and so on. I'll be cast out, so on and so forth. So yeah, it's difficult to say. I do think that there is a strong desire for more kind of heterodox thinking and for more kind of cross-party dialogue. I think that we're probably living through the first era of social media where social media became very powerful in politics. It wasn't even like 15 years ago, really it wasn't, or 10 years ago, it wasn't really that influential. It became very influential recently. And because we're living through the first era of it, I think we're still going to see how it's going to evolve and how people are going to respond to it. So, it's hard to say, but it's possible that social media becomes a more healthy environment in that regard.
Great. Well, thanks, Zaid. Appreciate your time.